I'm with RetirementHomes.com as brand manager. Welcome to today's webinar, Essential Tips for Communicating with Senior Prospects. Definitely going to get into the meat and potatoes a little bit, talk about some of the details there, what we hope to achieve, what we hope not to achieve. Certainly I'll say two things right from the get-go. That one, much of this, I should say not much of this, some of this will be a review for some of you. Some of it certainly will be new. And that's what I want to offer a little bit differently. I'm going to talk briefly about how to talk to seniors, how to address them, etiquette, and so on and so forth. And that's the thing we all need refresher on. But the approach as well is I'm going to offer something a little bit different and hopefully something very new. And that's really an approach where you're not so much selling to a senior where they are now. It's selling to a senior where their formative years were. In other words, not selling to Mabel Jones, an 87-year-old woman. It's selling to Mabel Jones, a 30 or 35-year-old woman. Where was she during those formative years? What was she experiencing? What were her hopes, dreams, fears, formative experiences, and what really colored her whole life? And so really selling to that is going to be a major focus. And so, without giving the entire webinar away, this is sort of just a touch of what we'll be talking about. For RetirementHomes.com, if you are familiar with us, great. If not, a little bit about us, of course. We are the world's most comprehensive cloud-based senior living directory. We basically specialize at the core, and we fill beds in senior living communities. So senior living homes will advertise on our site, and we will put prospects in those beds. So we're certainly a resource for seniors, baby boomers, webinars, newsletters, podcasts, articles, and so on, active social media presence, and of course for the senior living professionals themselves, we do sales training, and ultimately, of course, to say it again, we fill beds, so we get exposure and visibility for the community so they can achieve maximum and sustain maximum occupancy. So why this webinar? Again, as a senior living professional or as senior living professionals, you are certainly well adept, even if you're relatively junior in the role, you know how to talk to seniors, or at least you think you do, and you probably do. You will not be speaking to them in a very casual manner. You probably look the part, you probably dress the part, and you probably speak to them as you might speak to an older relative. And so what I'm going to be talking about, I have just a few caveats, a few qualifiers. One, of course, is care types matter. So what do I mean by that? By that I mean, if you work at an active living home in Arizona or in Florida, a warm, temperate climate like that, where the average age is, let's say, 71 years old, excuse me, and people are there not because they're dying, not because they have to be there. They're there for quality of life. They're there because they want to be there. They sold their homes or they've left wherever it is they live, and they've gone down to a warm place because they want to retire in the sun and spend their days golfing and sitting by the pool. Selling to that audience is an entirely different strategy than selling at a memory care home or facility, if you will, where you're not really selling to the residents themselves. You're selling to their children or to their spouses or to their guardians or whoever it is. So clearly there is a chasm of difference between selling to a senior who wants to escape the cold winters and shoveling the snow and wants to golf all day to selling to a lady whose husband has Alzheimer's and she doesn't know what she can do. So of course that's a caveat and a qualifier, and we'll get into that because ultimately that is a major difference as well. A qualifier, people will and do communicate differently. So what does that mean? It means that, of course, an 87-year-old woman will communicate differently than a 77-year-old woman and a 50-year-old woman, and so on and so forth. Although, again, a 50-year-old may not be in a home, but she might be looking for a loved one. So it's an idea that, of course, we're talking in generalities here, as specific as possible, and I'll get into exactly how to navigate your way through that. But ultimately what the difference is really is understanding that these are defining principles, they're guidelines, but of course they're not going to speak to everyone in every circumstance. And of course, finally as well, that there are other factors at play here, that selling in an environment in parts of California with large Spanish-speaking populations, speaking elsewhere in, let's say in the Northwest with perhaps Native American populations or different ethnic, religious, cultural, socioeconomic, and so on, very different audience here. A place, a retirement home, an upscale one in Manhattan is going to be different than a rural one in South Dakota. And so again, obviously as well that there are local flavors here and local flares, and that's just an important caveat to keep in mind as well. So without further ado, so again, what are we talking about here? Why this webinar? So you've heard the adage, people don't buy products, they buy people, right? If I am purchasing a car, a house, a widget, a baseball glove, whatever it is, well, maybe not a baseball glove, but something bigger than that, I buy something, of course, if I see value in it, but ultimately I have to like the salesperson. But in senior living, it's different. It's certainly true. You buy from people you like, but there's more than that. You buy from people you trust. And really what that means is as follows. If I buy a car or a house or a pair of shoes, or whatever it is, worst case scenario, it's a bad investment. Maybe it's a big investment, but ultimately it's still arm's length because whatever I purchased, as good or bad as it is, it's ultimately still just a purchase. Whereas when we're talking senior living, we are selling something intimately connected here. We are selling a person where they're spending probably their final years. The final years may be 6 months, they may be 10 years, but this in large part may be someone's where the rest of their years are spent. So it's very personal and it's very intimate, and what it really is that senior living professionals aren't just people who have to be credible. In other words, they have to know their thing. Certainly they do. And they can't just be likable, although certainly they have to be. They have to be trustworthy. And what that ultimately means is that a senior living professional has to be seen as someone who not just knows everything about their retirement home, and not just someone who maybe is likable and affable and someone who has a good rapport with the senior. More to the point, they have to be a person for whom the senior or their loved one has to know cares genuinely about their residents. Cares genuinely. When I say that they would turn away a sale if they didn't think it was the right thing to do. And that, of course, is many ways what we'll be talking about today, is how to ultimately show that. And you've always, of course, heard the joke, sincerity is the hardest thing to fake. We're talking about sincerity, of course, and that, I certainly wouldn't recommend selling a product if you didn't believe in it. But this is really about, showing that empathy, showing that trustworthiness, and ultimately making the senior living prospects and their loved ones trust you as well. So a little bit of background here, because again, it's about how to communicate with senior prospects. So, of course, when there are cognitive and physical abilities start to decline, that does make communication more difficult. Half of those 75 plus have hearing loss. That's going to make communication harder. 15%, about 1 in 6 of people, 75%, have vision loss. And again, substantial vision loss, not corrective lenses that they've worn since they were 20. We're talking about substantial vision loss. And 35%, so more than a third of people 85 plus have Alzheimer's. And again, that's just Alzheimer's disease. That's not other forms of dementia such as frontal lobe dementia, Lewy body dementia, and so on. So when we're talking about various forms of cognitive impairment, we're talking more than 50%. So all of these things together, cognitive impairment, vision impairment, hearing impairment, maybe physical immobility, lack of ambulatory movement, and so on. So all of this together, certainly on their own and certainly cumulatively, because these aren't necessarily mutually exclusive, means that it's harder to communicate. It's hard to communicate with anybody else and trying to understand where they're coming from. Certainly hard to communicate with someone if they can't see you, or if they have difficulty hearing you, or if they forgot what you said 5 minutes ago. So again, that's an added. And this is not just with anybody. This is just an added difficulty, an added layer of challenge for senior living professionals who are trying to sell to seniors. So, therefore, of course, communicating, both verbal and nonverbal form, is objectively harder with older people. I'm sure we can all agree with that. This is not a great novelty, a secret that I've come up with, but we have to define who are older people. And I'm not just defining this for the sake of defining it because it's important to define our terms, although that's true. But it's important because, again, when we're talking about different audiences, different groups, different selling techniques and features, we have to know who the audience is and to really drill down to that and understand how to communicate to each different group. So we have here a general overview of generations. And again, what I'll say about this is as follows, is that it's not to say when you see greatest generation silent and baby boomers, this is not to say that someone who's born in 1946 versus 1945 are radically different people. And it's not to say that everyone born within that 18-year period or cohort is going to fit these characteristics. Of course. What it suggests, though, is that people who are born during this period had their formative years, were raised, their childhood, adolescence, and so on during these time periods. And so really, again, what we'll get into is that a baby boomer who, let's say, is 60 years old today, someone who's turning 60 years old this year, who's born in 1955. Yes, they were born in 1955, and yes, they're 60 years old today, but the whole idea of this really is you're not selling to, John Smith, who's 60 years old today. You're selling to John Smith, who was a 25-year-old in 1980, because in 1980 were his formative years. So it's understanding the late 70s, the early 80s, and sort of that time period is equally important to just talking about him today, maybe that he's at the verge of retirement and then he's looking to scale back. So when we talk about these different generations here, again, it's not certainly a hard and fast rule, and it's not even just talking about where they are now. It's primarily talking about where they came from, and that really is the significance of this. So let's get started here. So the greatest generation, again, this is 1901 to 1924. So these are people who are 91 years old plus. Of course, I didn't go beyond that because we'll be dealing with 114-year-olds, and I think that's just too small a demographic really to be a consideration here. So 91 years old plus. So talk a little bit about here, nature versus nurture. We're going to talk about humans are products of the environment. So again, we're talking about not a 91-year-old today, it's about a 91-year-old maybe 70 or 65 years ago. And what we're ultimately doing is selling to their memories and to their youth and to their formative years. So this greatest generation, 91 years old plus, what are their characteristics? And when I say their characteristics, it's not had genetic dispositions then. It's that, what were the characteristics of that time period? They grew up a period, again, let's scale back here. They were born in probably the teens around the First World War. This is before the Depression, before the Second World War, of course. This was either they were born in and around the period of the First World War or during the Roaring 20s. So, responsibility, humility, work ethic, prudence, saving, loyalty. These are the kinds of characteristics you would see in someone, again, not by virtue that they're 91 years old, but these are the characteristics you'd see in someone who grew up during that time period. Someone who was born in 1920 might have come of age in the 40s. So these are people who came of age during the Second World War. These are people who understand, respect authority. They're not afraid of it. They were the authority. These were the officers, colonels in the military. These were the people who were 18, 20 years old, shipped off to Europe to fight. So these are people who certainly had to grow up very quickly, both the men and women. If the men went away to fight, the women here had to support their families. My own grandfather, had to quit school at 14 to support his family. So these are people who grew up very fast, who there's no messing around with. These are the people who will rebuke you if you don't speak to them nicely or correctly, and I'll give you a crack on your knuckle with his cane. So these are people who are serious and who really understand that that really they grew up quickly, and that today's generation just soft around the belly. So they're not going to take any guff from anybody. So how do you sell to them? Being straightforward. In other words, we're not treating this 91-year-old or 94-year-old, again, cognitive impairments aside, we're not treating these people as the infirm. These are older people, but these are older people who did at 20 what most of us could never imagine do. So these are people we have to talk to, not just because it's the right thing to do, but because they expect it, and they raise their children that way, and they raise their grandchildren that way, and this is how they expect to be spoken to, and if we don't speak to them that way, they will consider us as impudent, as rude, and as people who they are not going to entrust their lives with. So we have to be straightforward with them. We need to talk dollars and cents, traditional values. So it doesn't just mean have a picture of your kids there and how you're a family man, or you sort of you volunteer, and that's all great. But it's more fundamental. When I say traditional values, hard work, not lazing about, no excuses, this sort of thing. This is really what will appeal to people like that. Again, these are people who are at 18, 19, 20 years old, went off to Europe, or stayed here, quit school, supported their families. These are people who don't want to hear about college tuitions being high. These are people who are just used to having life throw everything at them and just taking it. And So traditional values means no excuses, full responsibility. Talk to them like that. No labeling. They're not older. They're not some old person who's, sitting in their rocking chair waiting for the Grim Reaper. Not at all. These are people for whom time is important because they've made so much of it in their lives. And so what's the takeaway? Respect and no nonsense. So again, generally speaking, selling to someone in the greatest generation, and of course this group is only getting smaller because they're so old, is that what that really means is speaking to them as people for whom there's awe. There's awe. Not fear, but awe. Real respect. Thank you very much for what you've done for our country, sir. Tell me all about it. Asking them, tell me about how you've experienced that life. How did you raise a family? How did you do that? Wow, what an impressive track record you've done. How did you build that business when you were doing all of that? Quite remarkable. This is how to sell to them. And again, it's not about sort of false sort of patting them on the back. They'll read right through that. It's about treating them with the respect and no nonsense. Sitting down with a pen and pad of paper if they don't think they can afford it and saying, may I be blunt? Let's talk about this. May I be blunt? And this is the group for whom you can close with the most easy, the easiest. And why is that? It means because you can look them in the eye and you can say to them, you know this is the right thing to do. Because they will listen to logic and they will listen to reason, and they're not just primarily dealing with emotion. The silent generation, let's scale back here. Silent generation, 1925 to 1945. So again, that's a 20-year gap. Big difference in someone who's someone who's born in 1925 because they're 90 years old today. Someone in 1945, they're only 70. 70-year-old versus a 90-year-old, completely different lives. 70-year-old might still be working. A 90-year-old also might still be working, but there's probably a huge difference here. So how do you sell to someone who's born in 1925? How do you sell to someone who's born in 1945? So again, let's do the math here. Someone born in 1925, 25 years old will be 50. Rather, 1950. Someone in 1945, their formative years of 25 years old will be 1970. So what are the characteristics of someone, again, even just think in your mind, 1950 versus 1970? How do you sell to this generation? What did they grow up in? And most importantly, who were their parents? So silent generation, why it's called the silent generation, again, just to back up as well, the greatest generation, well, these are 18-year-olds who saved the world. This is a great generation. Silent generation, these are people for whom, certainly, one, how could you live in that shadow? I mean, those are shoes you could never hope to fill. And also, really, there's a saying that sort of, I think, encapsulates that generation. Children are neither to be seen nor heard. So again, these are people for whom, tough authoritarian father, these are people for whom you were never, not good enough, but you were never really going to exceed their expectations. And so these are people who, again, someone who's born in 1925, they were 4 years old when the Depression hit. And then they grew up at that time. They grew up when there was starvation happening. Again, obviously, we're talking about people who grow up in North America. Europe might be different, and certainly elsewhere. Someone who's born in 1925, when they were 10 years old, that was the Depression. We'll remember that, right? And even though, they went from Depression straight to the war, and they weren't fighting in the war, their parents were, but there was that period sort of growing up during that fear. And again, someone born in 1945, a little bit different. They were born really at the tail end of it, and they remember perhaps the Cold War, but it was a very different time period as well. So really fearful of crisis, grew up during the Great Depression, thrifty and meaning-seeking, because these are the people for whom their parents were the tough ones. And these kids were the ones who, they lived during this tough period, and they saw what their parents did during the Great Depression when there was no money. And they saw what their parents did in fighting at such young ages. And they saw that, and you never really could live up to that. And so that's why ultimately it was never really about, for many of this generation here, it's that they always lived in their parents' shadows. And that's where sort of the silent generation. And I think that if we were going to characterize this as a person, if you were going to put the silent generation as a person, it's a sort of quiet older woman, 85-year-old woman sitting in a rocking chair, very polite, almost passive, almost afraid of her own shadow. Greatest generation, it's a 93-year-old man with a walking stick who'll hit you up the back of the head if he doesn't like the way you're talking. So again, that's a caricature, but we're talking about that's a caricature of the greatest generation. Very quiet, passive, almost scared old woman. That's a caricature of the silent generation. So how do you communicate with them? How do you sell to them? Respect for authority. They respected their parents. They respect their parents. They're conformists because ultimately they were told what to do and they were put into a mold. And again, history, elder-oriented. They saw what their parents did. They will always live in that shadow. That's how you sell to them. You sell to them because they trust authority. They trust doctors, nurses, the kinds of people at your home. They want to believe what you're telling them. They want to avoid conflict. They're not confrontational people. They're not, again, generally speaking, given their upbringing, they're not going to fight that. And again, they want to keep inheritance for their children. So they don't want to make irresponsible financial decisions. They want to be responsible people who are going to take care of their loved ones. And what's the takeaway? Credibility counts. If your memory care home has an excellent ratio of staff, say it. If your residence or chain has been recognized or certified in a particular area, mention it. You are the experts. You are the best at what you do. And again, I think this leads a little bit more when it's higher level of care, but this is really the area that's going to be most important. Sell to the silent generation with credibility. Sell to the greatest generation with facts, ABC, almost an A-type personality, so very, very different. And the baby boomers, of course. Baby boomers, and again, we'll scale back here and just take a look, reminder of the age, 1946 to 1964. So we're talking 49 years old to 69, and of course, a 49-year-old is going to be very different than a 69-year-old. A 49-year-old might have little kids. A 69-year-old also might. But generally speaking, a 69-year-old likely retired, and a 49-year-old likely in the prime of their career or not even yet. So these are people also at very different points. And again, we'll talk about different age. Someone born in the mid-1940s, they came of age, let's say, late 60s, right? Woodstock and all of that. Someone born in 1964, they came of age in the 80s. So very different time periods, and how do you sell to that? So opposite of the silent generation, just as silent generation is the opposite of the greatest generation, baby boomers are the opposite of that. They grew up during unprecedented wealth, right? In the post-war period, the fertility rate in the West, Canada, United States was close to 4 children per woman. Why? Because when people are positive and they're optimistic about the future, they have families. If you're fearful about the future, you don't have large families on sort of a grand demographic scale. So people had large families. People had one job, and the husband had one job. He had a defined benefit, so he worked his whole life at the factory, like Leave It to Beaver, and he could, support his family and all of that, and they could go on vacations, and they were comfortable. Unprecedented wealth, unprecedented stability, notwithstanding things like hiding under the desk during the Cold War fear, but generally speaking, we're talking about a period here of, wealth and stability and comfort, and the war is past you, okay? Countercultural, right? We're talking about Vietnam protests, free love, Woodstock, and so on. Can you imagine these people's parents at the Vietnam protests, generally speaking? No, of course not. You could never do something like that that's so countercultural. And their grandparents would slap them upside the head for being there. So this is a very different type of generation here. And these are people who are comfort-seeking. And I think in many ways that the baby boomers are probably the easiest to sell to, not because there's anything objective about it, but really it's that it's most familiar to us, and I think we've seen that's where most of the advertising in general that we see. And then I think it will strike us as probably quite familiar. So how to sell to them? It's all about lifestyle. Someone who grew up in the 1950s, middle-class people, they belong to country clubs. Middle-class people, they went on exotic vacations. Middle-class people, their parents retired at 55. So these are people who didn't see pain, suffering, turmoil, and toil and pestilence and any of that. They saw their parents who worked hard, but you know what? They were well treated for that, and they received a good life. So they want something that's easy to use, that's convenient, that's luxurious. And I think if I had to put that in a sentence, you deserve it. You've worked hard, baby boomer. Baby boomer, you're 50 years old or you're 69 years old. You're probably, let's say, in the medium middle, maybe about 60 years old. You've worked hard your whole life. Maybe you've retired already. Maybe you're about to retire. But you know what? You deserve it. Now, you can just see that on a luxury car or a Volvo commercial. You deserve it. And I think this is the takeaway when selling to a baby boomer. It's that comfort self. Again, talking to a silent generation, this is your obligation to your children. What would happen if you fell and you broke your knee or you broke your hip at home? What would happen to your children if they didn't know where you were? What would happen to you? You'd be letting them down, right? That's the silent generation. Always so afraid, always looking out for other people. Greatest generation is, Here's the most responsible thing to do with your time. Here's the most responsible thing to do with your money. Baby boomers, very different. Baby boomers, it's not about responsibility. It's not about giving back to other people. It's about taking care of yourself. And again, I think this would really look familiar to most of us, because this is exactly what the kind of advertising we see, because baby boomers are a large, second largest now. The millennials are larger now, but they're the second largest, but they are by far the wealthiest demographic. And so these people, comfort is key. So getting, of course, into watching your language. So we have an understanding of sort of the general demographic cohorts. How do we speak with language? So again, most of it, I'm sure you would not use many of these terms, really. I don't think any of these terms, certainly when dealing with seniors and older people. And again, I use the term seniors, older people. We always have to use terms really as descriptors. But really the point, the principle here, is that to avoid language that is ageist. When I say ageist, it means that you hear it and you sort of, ooh, that's not a nice thing. It sort of makes you just clam up a little bit. It's not a nice thing to say because it's negative. Aged, elderly, oldster, senile, feeble. You could also use decrepit, infirm. We would never use that term, of course, but it could slip out. But not just when it slips out. We could make it, if we're selling, we could make it in reference to someone else or another home and so on. And it can just come out as disrespectful. So again, these are the types of terms, and this is only you can find 100 terms like this, but really sort of the takeaway from that, avoid language that categorizes as older people, however you want to define that, 60 plus, 70 plus, 80 plus, 90 plus, negative. That's the issue. You can call someone an older person. That's not negative. That's really not an issue. Calling someone elderly, it has a bit of a connotation to it. Making prospects comfortable. Right? We talked about how there's really two aspects when we're talking about communication. Obviously, there's the verbal, and of course, there's the nonverbal as well. And so there's a whole process. And so what does that mean? It means walk around their level of comfort, not vice versa. So what does that mean? It means that if a time works best for them, work around that time. If a place to meet, maybe the first meeting or the second meeting doesn't have them come to the home, maybe go and meet them. Maybe it means meeting them for coffee. Maybe they want to learn some information before they're willing to come in. Because if they're really afraid, and again, sort of the impasse that sort of they're facing is the idea of any senior living community as a nursing home, a scary facility, they're never going to go in there. So sometimes we have to work around them. Ask how they like to be addressed. John, can I call you John? Would you prefer I call you Mr. Smith? Those are the sorts of small compromises we need to make. Ask for feedback. Do you understand what I'm saying? Does that make sense to you? Am I speaking too quickly? Am I speaking loud enough? So on and so forth. And again, selling to features, not to benefits. Or sorry, to benefits, not to features. So again, you can show someone around your lovely community gushing on and on about how beautiful it is and the chandelier and, oh, how gorgeous it is. And the person tells you, well, I actually have macular degeneration, so I really can't see very much. Well, you feel sort of silly because you've been talking about something on, and they don't see it. So again, it's selling to benefits. When I say benefits, it's how that person is going to receive benefit from it, not features. Because ultimately, we're only going to find that through whether you want to call it a discovery, whether you want to call it a consultative sales process, whether you want to add a question-based selling, whatever it is, it's asking them what they need and then selling to that, not simply vomiting on information and hoping something sticks. And again, apologize for that graphic analogy, but there you go. Hopefully that sticks with you. So what's a verbal communication checklist that we need to do when we're dealing with and selling to older people? So of course, a needs analysis should be done before a tour. Try to qualify prospects before they ever step foot in your home. Why? Let me give you an example. Let's say somebody is looking for, oh gosh, let's talk about assisted living or memory care. So it's not someone, it's for their mother. Their mother is 85 years old. She has dementia. The mother's 85 years old. She's cognitively fine, but she needs some help. But you know what? She needs some help, but she's otherwise physically good. She's incontinent, but she's physically otherwise pretty good. So having that needs analysis done beforehand means that you can decide the best time for a tour because you can know who's going to be around at that time and who they're going to see during that time. Last thing you want to do is to have someone who's physically good come at a time when, who knows, it's just a bad time because those are the people who are physically very mobile, have an art class or have a song, music session, something like that. Know where, let's say you're more physically incapable residents are. Maybe those aren't the best people to show because, again, they'll eventually see them, but it's a matter of seeing that is the only thing they'll see. So, again, it's having that sensitivity as well. Ask about special accommodations. Can I get you a tea beforehand? Does it need to be wheelchair accessible? Make sure your room is big enough. Make sure it's not too small. It can't be too hot, too cold. Lights are too bright. Sensitivity, things like that. Ask, of course, this is before open-ended questions. And, of course, not just summarize what you're saying. You need to summarize. You need to say what you're going to say it, and then tell you, and then repeat what you said. You need to ask your prospects to summarize. Based on what what I've said, what kind of people do you think live here? Ask them that. What kind of people do you think live here? Well, I think that really, really sick people live here. Okay, well, it's good for you to know that because if that's their perception, you need to do a little more needs analysis and you need to sell specifically to what their concerns are. And, of course, avoiding jargon. I think that should be obvious in sales across the board. Offer checklists. Give them a clipboard and things that they can mark down. Give them questions that they can ask suggested or items that they can mark off as they see it. How many, food, activity, programs, things like that. And then rephrase. Say it in a couple different ways. Don't just say it louder. And it's a good way to ask someone before as well whether you're saying it loud enough or too loud. Nonverbal checklist. So avoid physical barriers. Talked about that. A nice potted plant might be nice, but if it's sort of in the way, hard to see for someone who's, smaller or, bad posture and so on, it might not be possible. Remain seated. Standing could be intimidating for someone. Again, if they're older and they have a smaller stature. Be interested in what you're talking about. And again, that's not just faking sincerity, but having real sincerity. Actually listen. And really, this is where the active listening comes from in sales, where you're not just listening to them and saying, okay, I'm going to wait for them to finish so I can continue. It's asking so you can respond, so you can ask a question. That's interesting that you said that, Mr. Miller. I'm wondering, what do you mean by that? What do you mean that you're lonely right now? What are you afraid of? What are you really looking for? What kind of environment are you aiming for? So again, it's really being interested, so you can ask good, intelligent questions about what they're talking about. Show, don't tell. So, of course, that means that don't just describe in flyer language. Let them see it for themselves. Full eye contact, that should be an obvious, again, for across the age cohorts. Full attention, and it really speaks to being interested. No watch or phone. So if you need to know the time, put away your phone. Don't check your watch, but perhaps have a clock behind their head above so you can sort of surreptitiously glance at it without it looking, because it looks very rude to older people. Even if you're using your phone just to check the time, it looks rude, and it's very hard to overcome that feeling of negativity. And then, of course, make sure that everything is barrier-free, wheelchair, walker, accessible, and so on. Telephone systems. When someone's calling in, does your operator, the automatic operator, accommodate rotary phones? If not, you may be losing out on an older demographic who can't call in. Is it easy to connect to the receptionist? Do you just have to hit 0, or if it's 0, it's a voicemail? How can someone talk to a real, live, breathing human being? Is there an option on the phone to repeat the menu? Is there a message reminding someone, make sure to grab a pen and paper now, I'm going to be telling you extensions, right? Make it easy for them. T2Y, really this is sort of voice-operated phone. Can your phone system accommodate that? And again, volume and speed of greetings, are there ways to accommodate that? Does your phone system take into account people may be hard of hearing, or perhaps speaking as quickly as I am is not a good idea if you're leaving a greeting for seniors. It may be, hi, you've reached Robert Walker at RetirementHomes.com. I'm not available, and so on, as opposed to, hi, you've reached Robert Walker, RetirementHomes.com, and so on. So there's a real speed there that may come naturally, and I'm certainly doing it now. I know that I'm personally someone who tends to speak quickly, but again, when talking to seniors, want to slow down. You want to do an audit of your marketing materials, and again, many of you, I'm sure, are simply on the sales side. These marketing materials is going to be done at the corporate level or on a different level, and it's not something that you're responsible for. Even for those, it's important that perhaps you raise these questions, concerns, considerations, and so on. Certainly, if your role does include marketing, then absolutely this would fall under your purview. So make sure to do an audit, because again, it's not just about how you speak to someone when you meet them. It's not just about how you talk to them, how you act. It's about qualifying beforehand, making sure your office is barrier-free, your phone systems, all of that. The What about your marketing materials? Check your website. Are the letters large? Is it easy to use? Is it easy to contact somebody? Minimal graphics, again, too. If people have dial-up internet or a slow internet connection, having a pop-up video or moving graphics may look very nice on your computer, but for someone who has a slow internet connection, gosh, your website is going to load so slowly, they're probably just going to give up. So again, bear in mind, keep it simple, silly, is a good rule of thumb for something like that for a website when you're dealing with older people. Look at your print collateral. When I say that, brochures, pamphlets, sales kits, things like that. Text, is it big? Is there a clear direction? What is it asking people to do? People who look like your prospects. So make sure that the pictures of people you use look like the residents you have. Let me give you the example I mentioned earlier. Let's say you sell in parts of Arizona, Texas, New Mexico, Nevada. There may be a lot of Hispanics, Spanish people of Spanish descent, Mesoamerican, and so on. Do the pictures in your pamphlet of your residents. Maybe they are actual residents, or maybe they're just stock images, but do they look like the people who live at your home? And more importantly, do they look like the people who are coming for tours? Do they look like your prospects? Because if they don't, then it may be difficult for your prospects to look and see themselves in there. When taking a look at your radio and TV ads, of course, make sure it's slow, clear, repeat the phone number, have it there the whole time if it's television. And of course, RetirementHomes.com, one of the benefits, really the benefit primarily of digital marketing, not only that it offers more bang for its buck, everything is measurable, trackable, better return on investment, and you can see it. If you spend $10,000 on radio and TV ads, you're hoping, A, that your sales reps are asking every single prospect where they heard about you, and B, you're also hoping that the prospects are saying it accurately and everything is being logged. When it comes to digital marketing, everything is tracked, so it's great. So the salespeople can ask or not ask, but everything is logged anyway. So it offers just an incomparable form of return on investment. But nonetheless, that's more of a side point, but it's something to keep in mind as well. Of course, newspaper, know your audience. Now, what kind of newspaper is this? A community paper? Where the front page will be the local sports team, winning a baseball tournament, or is this a large daily paper? Is this an ethnic newspaper? Non-English, so on. So again, these are considerations, but it's knowing your audience and making sure that the images reflect that. Your website, and again, I mentioned website in the last slide, but just to talk about it in a little bit more detail, make sure all the text is sans serif, like Helvetica, double space, easy to see, nothing smaller than size 12 font. And for example, only use italics for headings. So italics may be harder to read. Only have them for headings. Underlining, only make it for hyperlinks. So, not for something you just want to emphasize, just for hyperlinks. Ensure contrast. So again, black and white, not, let's say, yellow and green, because that could be difficult to distinguish. And again, consider a lot of people will only have black and white screens, or perhaps you remember the sort of green and black screens. So if you have two images that are very similar, and maybe for people to see the difference to discern the different colors. So make it simple. And avoid pull-down menus. Again, it may be difficult for people to navigate their way through that. And always have a sitemap as well. That's good both for SEO, for search engine optimization purposes, as well as navigation purposes. Have memory aids for prospects. So when you're meeting somebody, if they want to come back, they say, you know what, listen, I enjoyed it. I'm going to have my brother come. If it's, two people looking for their mother, I have to have my brother come. You know what, I want to have my friend come. He'll give me my thoughts, so on. Have stickers for that. Cards. Your next tour, like at the dentist. Your next appointment is do something like that. Certainly a phone call, reminder email, things like that. Of course, after the tour, grab freshly baked bread from the kitchen, take it with them, or 2 days later, drop it off at their home. Again, these are things which have a big impact, a very positive impact on prospects. But again, work for what works with them. And one really tip that I think could be valuable is have some different literature available. So let's say someone comes for the tour and they were really struck by the amenities. They love the billiards room, they love the games room, they love the library, they love the gym, they love the bistro, the cafe, the theater. They loved all of that. But you know what? When they leave, 3 days later, you're following up with them, a day later, 2 days later, 3 days later, and maybe it's 2 weeks later until you finally speak. The emotions that they felt that day were very strong. They loved it. But 2 weeks later, they don't quite remember. So consider having different literature available to be able to customize the sales kit. So you're not simply giving every single person who comes through the same thing. If a person comes through, slip in a little, extra literature that talks specifically about the gym. And someone else, they love the food. They couldn't stop talking about how good the food was. Because again, food is huge in senior living. Have a separate insert about that. So again, it's about customizing everything. After the tour, again, drop off a card at their home, drop off a pastry at their home, send them flowers, send them emails, say hello when you're following up. Don't follow up for the sake of following up. Follow up, how you feeling, how you doing, how's your hip, how's your mom doing, whatever it is. You're not following up because you're a salesperson. You're following up because you care. And so what's a brief recap here? Know the generations, right? So again, someone who's 90 years old today, it's not about selling to a 9-year-old. It's selling about to someone who's born in 1925, whose coming of age was in the 1940s. That's very different, right? Know your specific demographic. It's about not just age, it's about income level, ethnicity, language, religion, and so on and so forth. It's really understanding part of the country, part of the continent, where in the world they live, so on, what their interests are. What do your prospects want and need? Selling to their specific needs. And not, again, that's really where the benefits, not features, comes in. Use key points, easy to remember, make it simple. Speak clearly, confidently, but respectfully as well, right? Don't talk to them like they're idiots. Don't talk to them like they're children. Talk to them like they're adults who are cognitively well and can understand everything you're saying. But you know what? As an insurance policy, make sure to remind them and have the tools available to do so as well. Ensure the consistency of marketing materials, not just in language, but in terms of everything that you're doing. Make sure that each demographic is being communicated the same messages again and again. And, of course, follow up, follow up, follow up. Final thoughts. There are a lot of different tools that are available. Again, different senior living communities, demographics will obviously have different specific challenges. Focus groups. That's certainly something that is expensive, but might be an option for you as well. Getting a group of older people, if your community is in whatever town, perhaps having a polling research group, having a focus group. See what's going to be what messages are going to resonate with the target demographic that you're looking at. Check out Google Trends. Google Trends basically allows you to have a finger on the pulse of what people are searching online. What's happening? Where's the trend going now versus 2 years ago? And can that maybe give you any more analytics and any more information there? Consultants, again, can be expensive, but perhaps can, if it's sometimes your price is just a little too high. Sometimes you're targeting just to the wrong audience. Sometimes it's just a change or two you can make to your community. And, of course, consider additional research and resources as well. And, of course, want to thank everyone for their time today. I know we had a big crowd, so I want just a couple questions here. And the first question is, how can I qualify prospects and know which demographic they are a part of? So I suppose what's being asked, I think, and tell me if I'm incorrect here, what you're asking is, how can you know someone's age? And certainly it's a good question, and it depends on the demographic. We're talking about assisted living, memory care. You're probably not talking to the prospect themselves. You're talking to their loved ones. So you can ask, you're calling for your mom. How old is your mom? How old is your mom? Oh, she's 93. That's not hard to get. If you're talking about people themselves, maybe the age will come up. Maybe you can suss out the information. Oh, you're married. How long you've been married for? Oh, you have grandkids. How long your grandkids? Oh, tell me. Talk to them. Right? This is where sort of that discovery part, that qualifying process comes in, where it's not about asking directly, how old are you? You'll get an idea. How long have they been retired for? Okay, so maybe you'll be off by 5, 7, 8, 10 years. But you know what? It's not going to be a major difference. And it probably will come up sooner than you expected, but you don't need to ask how old you are, obviously. I shouldn't say obviously. That's not necessary. If someone may want to offer that, it may come up already. I'm 73 years old, but I feel like a 20-year-old. And they might say that. But again, it's about sussing out that information and doing it in a way that is certainly respectful, but with an eye to sales as well. We have another question here as well. What is the difference in follow-up between older and younger seniors? So, in other words, how can you're following up of a 65-year-old. A 65-year-old is looking for an active living community in Scottsdale, Arizona. How do you follow up with that person differently than an 87-year-old person who, they've been diagnosed with dementia, and you know what, they know that they may be okay now, but in 6 months, a year, 2 years, things are going to change. Of course, there's a lot of differences following up, a lot of different ways. You're going to appeal to very different parts of this, really, people's emotions. So, talking about the 87-year-old, it's about what would happen if you stayed at home. Versus a 65-year-old, it's not about what would happen if you stayed at home. Well, I would have to shovel the driveway. I'd have to cut the grass, and I hate that. It's really not a big deal. Whereas in the latter example, it's about really the worst-case scenario is staying where you are now. And so in terms of following up, it's an understanding of that. It's sending them relevant articles, certainly the latter one where there's health issues. For the first one, it's certainly staying in touch as well, following up regularly. But what it is it's more of a conversation. It's more of saying hello. It's more of spending time. You're building rapport. You're becoming friends. And with the second one, you're more of a trusted professional, an expert. So it's a very different, it's not necessarily about frequency of following up. It's more about sort of the approach and more about sort of the message that's being given. And so it looks like we're actually out of time in terms of questions. Of course, my contact is there, Robert at RetirementHomes.com, my telephone number as well. Any questions at all, please contact me. But that's it for the January webinar. We'll be back next month. And again, catch us there. And this will be recorded, and the slides will be sent out as well. If you have any questions, feel free to reach me. Other than that, have a wonderful day. Take care.